Hey everyone, Tactics here, and today we finally figured out the 8 dungeons that are going to be in the Dragonflight Season 1 Mythic Plus pool. Now, for those of you unaware, Blizzard has kind of already announced that there's only going to be 4 of the Dragonflight release dungeons in this pool, as well as 4 returning dungeons that are going to be joining them as well. So all 8 Dragonflight dungeons are not going to be available in this Mythic Plus season pool on launch. 4 of them in season 1, 4 of them in season 2. Now, I will put a bit of a disclaimer here. I'm not 100% sold on this idea yet. I'm willing to have an open mind. I've enjoyed how season 4 has played out, but it just kind of does feel a little bit bad that half of the new dungeon content is not playable until season 2, but I digress. Moving on though, what we do have now is these are the 4 Dragonflight dungeons. Not too much of an opinion on them yet. Notably, there's the dragon riding dungeon. If you guys have heard about that, the dungeon that does involve you dragon riding between packs is in season 1, so that's going to be interesting. But then we have the 4 dungeons returning. So we have Court of Stars and Halls of Valor from Legion, Shadowmoon Burial Grounds from Warlords of Draenor, and Temple of the Jade Serpent from Mists of Pandaria. Now let's talk about these dungeons a little bit here. So the one I'm the least familiar with is Temple of the Jade Serpent. I wasn't really a big dungeon player in Mists of Pandaria, so the end of my experience with this dungeon is like time walking or leveling up, queuing for this dungeon, that kind of thing. So it seems okay enough. I think I do recall the book boss being a bit random between what it can choose, so hopefully they do something to address that. I'm not the biggest fan of like rotating bosses in Mythic Plus like Opera, because like there's some weeks that are just going to be significantly harder than others, on top of the fact that affixes, you have to get good affixes and a decent random boss. So not the biggest fan, but I mean, unless they make the boss static the entire season, making it static from week to week is probably the only other solution for that. But moving on to Shadow and Burial Grounds, I am actually kind of happy to see this as the Warlords of Draenor dungeon. I actually voted for Shadow Moon and Slag Mines for season 4, so I enjoy this dungeon. I will say though, the WoD dungeons aren't without problems. So there are quite a few issues with Iron Docks and Grimrail going into, or we've learned throughout season 4. A big one was telegraph. So there are a lot of abilities that just didn't show any telegraphs whatsoever, and some of those have been fixed, right? You have those fire arrows in the first boss of Iron Docks, or the lightning breath in the last boss of Grimrail, which were fixed. They now have telegraphs, but there's a bunch of things that still don't have telegraphs, right? Like the barbed arrow, I think, killing a lot of players still on the first boss of Iron Dogs. No, he has 2 abilities that had these lack of telegraphs, but those arrows are still like almost no telegraphs and deal a ton of damage and can murder you. There's also like the guys at the beginning of Grimrail that have 0-second cast time, frontal cleave attack that will just one-shot melee DPS, and honestly do a big chunk of tank damage as well, right? Those need to have telegraphs, in my opinion. Another thing was like abuse of LOS or pathing or fake walls. It was very, very prevalent in the WoD dungeons, right? You could break boss mechanics, you could completely ignore trash mechanics, you could group mobs to places you normally shouldn't or wouldn't be able to, right? So I think the big thing for these older dungeons, and this applies to Temple of the Jade Serpent as well, I'm just less familiar with it, for them to be well received, Blizzard needs to go through these dungeons extremely thoroughly, look at trash mechanics, boss mechanics, and the dungeon design, walls, all those kind of things itself, and make sure they bring these up to date um, for the actual Dragonflight season. It's going to be a lot more work than using, a Legion or a BFA dungeon, but I do still have hope for the WoD dungeons at least. I think there's some great dungeons from Mop and WoD. They are just going to require a little bit more work on Blizzard's end to get them up to date. But I think it's possible, and I hope they do it well. Then that brings us to Court of Stars and Halls of Valor, which are the 2 dungeons I actually have the biggest problem with on this list. So starting out with Court of Stars, right? The whole argument for this dungeon pool rotating and only having 4 Dragonflight dungeons is, hey, we want there to be fresh dungeons every pool. But right away, Court of Stars breaks that own rule, right? That it breaks the rule that they've put out, because it's been a dungeon that we've been able to run when Legion time walking or a huge amount of time in 9.1.5. it's been reused, right? All throughout Shadowlands, or I guess the later part of Shadowlands, right? It's a dungeon only a couple weeks ago, like you could spam for Legion Time Walking Mythic Plus, right? Obviously that's gone, or going to be gone in Dragonflight, but it's still, the dungeon doesn't really feel fresh anymore because of, I mean, there are two dungeons that people spam the hell out of during Legion Time Walking, right? Which was Court of Stars and Vault of the Wardens for the various trinkets and the ring in Court of Stars. And so that dungeon doesn't really feel fresh to me anymore. And frankly, I'm also not really a big fan of the whole random profession elements in the dungeon. That's another story entirely, right? It's not like this dungeon is difficult or long or anything like that. It's just it doesn't feel fresh. It doesn't feel like it fits the mantra that Blizzard is pushing here. And I don't think it should really be included, especially when there's so many good BFA dungeons that just aren't included, right? They've chosen 2 Legion dungeons, and then they've chosen a WoD dungeon and a mob dungeon. I don't see a reason why there shouldn't be a BFA dungeon here. Then we come to Halls of Valor, and this is just, I mean, from what I remember, this was a universally disliked dungeon. It's extremely long, right? A 45-minute timer, and even if the timer is relatively lenient, which I've heard some people talk about, the bosses in there are just not fun. It's full of one-shots, and of course, Legion was a time where people had gear sets in dungeons, right? They would switch to tank trinkets for half of these bosses in Halls of Valor. I'm really not excited if this is a Mythic Plus dungeon, and I really hope they reconsider because there are so many better choices to add. I mean, let's just look. Let's look at the dungeon journal, right? Here's BFA. Some pretty decent dungeons that I would like better than both Court of Stars and Halls of Valor. Ataldazar, 100%. Freehold, 100%. King's Rest, no. Let's not do that. Shrine of Storms is pushing it. I'm leaning towards no. Same with Siege. Temple of Sethraliz, honestly, I think I'd prefer to both of those dungeons, to be honest with you. Motherlode, 100%. Underrot, 100%. Aldegor, no. Waycrest Manor, no. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 dungeons out of BFA alone that I would prefer to Court of Stars or Halls of Valor. Obviously, note, this is all opinionated now. I mean, I guess the whole video is opinionated, but you know, if you disagree, let me know down in the comments. Tell me I'm an idiot, you know. Even if you look at Legion, though, dungeons I would prefer. This is probably going to upset people because I would actually prefer both Cathedral and Seat to Court of Stars and Halls of Valor. Not only that, I mean, they're both not been used in Legion Time Walking either, so they would actually be fresh. Maw of Souls, of course, easy slam dunk option, but you know, even Arcway, I think I would prefer to these 2 dungeons, to be honest with you. And again, all 4 of these dungeons have not been used in Legion Time Walking, would be very fresh, and especially Maw of Souls is a fan favorite. Obviously, Cathedral and Seat are certainly not. But Maw of Souls is, and I think these are great dungeons to use, right? There's a lot of other options. I just don't know why Court of Stars and Halls of Valor were the 2 choices. That's all I'm confused about. But you know, let me know what you guys think about this down in the comments below. Would love to know what you guys think. Of course, if you enjoyed this video, if you want to stay up to date with all the Dragonflight content, I'll be covering all that stuff. Lots of Mythic Plus guides, raid guides, all that stuff. So make sure you guys subscribe to my channel, turn on notifications. Have any questions, come check out my Twitch stream. I stream high keys, Mythic rating from a tank perspective. Love to have you guys come and hang out, so make sure you check me out. Don't be a stranger, and I'll see you guys in the next video.